Do you ever feel like you're in a room full of people, yet completely invisible? Jonas's words hung in the air, barely audible over the fading sounds of laughter and clinking glasses. He hadn't meant to say it aloud, but the weight of the evening had pressed it out of him. The house was quieter now. The family barbecue had ended, leaving the remnants of togetherness scattered, like the empty plates on the table. Jonas stood at the edge of the patio, gazing out at the darkening sky, his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Behind him, the screen door creaked open. "It's funny you say that," came the voice of his stepfather, Marcus. Deep, measured, and with just enough warmth to send a twinge through Jonas's gut. Jonas turned, surprised to find Marcus still there. Everyone else had left, siblings, cousins, even his mother, who had excused herself hours ago, claiming exhaustion. Yet Marcus lingered, his tall frame leaning casually against the doorframe, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "I thought you'd gone to bed," Jonas said, his voice steadier than he felt. Marcus stepped onto the patio, the soft thud of his boots on the wooden planks punctuating the stillness. "I figured someone should clean up," he replied, motioning to the mess left behind. "But I saw you out here and thought maybe you could use some company." Jonas's stomach flipped. Company? That wasn't what he'd expected. Wasn't what he wanted. Or was it? The glow of the patio lights cast shadows across Marcus's face, accentuating the sharp angles of his jaw and the lines around his eyes. Jonas had always thought Marcus was too handsome for his own good, with a confidence that seemed effortless, magnetic. "Sure," Jonas murmured, not trusting himself to say more. They worked side by side for a while, collecting plates and empty bottles, the silence between them charged but not uncomfortable. Jonas tried to focus on the task, but his mind kept drifting, to Marcus's proximity, to the way his hand brushed against Jonas's when they reached for the same plate, to the scent of his cologne mingling with the crisp night air. "You've been quiet tonight," Marcus said suddenly, breaking the spell. Jonas hesitated. "Just thinking, I guess." "About what?" Marcus's gaze was steady, probing. Jonas shrugged, trying to sound casual. "Life. How things never turn out the way you expect." Marcus chuckled softly. That's the truth. There was something in his tone, bittersweet, almost wistful, that made Jonas look at him. For the first time, he noticed the faint weariness in Marcus's expression, the way his shoulders seemed heavier than usual. "Are you okay?" Jonas asked, surprising himself with the question. Marcus's eyes flickered, his mask slipping for just a moment. "I'm fine. Just tired." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Long day." Jonas wanted to press further, but didn't. Instead, he nodded and went back to stacking plates. Minutes passed. The patio grew quieter, the night settling around them like a heavy blanket. Jonas was hyper-aware of Marcus's every movement, every glance. He felt as if the space between them was alive, pulsing with something unspoken. "Why did you stay?" Jonas asked finally, the question escaping before he could stop it. Marcus paused, his hands stilling on the edge of the table. "I don't know," he said, his voice low. "Maybe I wasn't ready to leave yet." Their eyes met, and for a moment, Jonas felt like the world had narrowed to just the two of them. The air was thick, the silence electric. He wanted to say something, to break the tension, but his throat was dry, his mind racing. Marcus cleared his throat, stepping back. "We should finish up," he said, his tone neutral, almost clipped. Jonas nodded, but his heart was pounding. As they worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them, something he couldn't name but couldn't ignore. By the time they finished, the patio was spotless, but the air between them was anything but. Marcus lingered for a moment, his eyes lingering on Jonas before he finally turned to go inside. "Good night, Jonas," he said softly, the door clicking shut behind him. Jonas stood there, alone again, staring at the empty patio. His pulse was racing, his thoughts a jumble. He knew he should go to bed, but his feet wouldn't move. He felt suspended in that moment, unsure of what it meant, but certain it wasn't over. The night stretched ahead, full of possibilities he couldn't yet understand. The sound of the clock ticking in the dimly lit kitchen seemed louder than it should have been. Jonas had come inside after lingering on the patio, but sleep was the last thing on his mind. He poured himself a glass of water, hoping the mundane action would calm the storm of thoughts swirling in his head. Just as he was about to head to his room, Marcus's voice broke the silence. Couldn't sleep either? Jonas turned to see Marcus standing in the doorway, his hands in the pockets of his sweatpants. He had changed out of his earlier clothes into something more casual, but the sight of him, relaxed yet still commanding, only made Jonas's pulse quicken. "Yeah," Jonas replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "Too much on my mind, I guess." Marcus stepped into the room, his movements slow, deliberate. "Same here. Nights like this always feel heavy, don't they?" Jonas nodded, unsure how to respond. There was something in Marcus's tone, a weight that hadn't been there before. It wasn't sadness exactly, but something close, something that made Jonas want to understand him more. Marcus leaned against the counter, folding his arms. "You've grown up a lot, Jonas. I don't think I've ever told you that." Jonas felt his cheeks flush. "Thanks, I guess." "I mean it," Marcus continued, his gaze steady. "You're not the same kid I met years ago. You're different now. Stronger, smarter." Jonas's heart thudded in his chest. The way Marcus was looking at him, intense, unflinching, made it hard to breathe. He didn't know what to say, so he stayed silent, gripping the glass in his hand like it was a lifeline. "Do you ever feel like you're stuck between who you are and who everyone expects you to be?" Marcus asked suddenly, his voice quieter now. Jonas blinked, startled by the question. "All the time," he admitted. Marcus nodded, his eyes distant. "Yeah, it's exhausting, isn't it?" There was a vulnerability in Marcus's voice that Jonas hadn't heard before. It was disarming, pulling him closer even though he knew he should keep his distance. "Marcus," Jonas hesitated, searching for the right words. "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because you're the only one who might understand." The room seemed to shrink around them, the air thick with unspoken tension. Jonas set his glass down on the counter, his fingers trembling. "I don't know what you mean," Jonas said, though he wasn't sure if he was lying to Marcus or to himself. Marcus stepped closer, his eyes locking onto Jonas's. "I think you do." The space between them evaporated. Jonas could feel the heat radiating from Marcus, the subtle scent of his cologne mixed with something deeper, rawer. His breath hitched as Marcus reached out, his fingers brushing against Jonas's arm. "This is wrong," Jonas whispered, though he made no move to step away. "I know," Marcus replied, his voice barely audible. "But it doesn't feel that way, does it?" Jonas's head spun. Every instinct told him to walk away, to break whatever spell had drawn them together. But his feet stayed rooted to the floor, his body betraying the chaos in his mind. Before he could think, Marcus closed the distance between them, his hand cupping Jonas's face. The touch was gentle, hesitant, as if giving Jonas a chance to pull away. But Jonas didn't. The kiss was slow, tentative at first, but it quickly deepened, years of suppressed emotion spilling out all at once. Jonas's hands found their way to Marcus's chest, gripping his shirt as if to steady himself. Time seemed to stop. The world outside faded into nothingness, leaving only the two of them in this stolen moment. When they finally broke apart, their breaths were ragged, their faces inches apart. Marcus's eyes searched Jonas's, as if looking for reassurance. "We shouldn't have done that," Marcus said, his voice thick with regret. I know, Jonas replied, though the words felt hollow. Before either of them could say more, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. They froze, panic flashing in their eyes. Go to your room, Marcus whispered urgently, stepping back. Jonas nodded, his heart racing as he slipped past Marcus and disappeared into the darkness of the hallway. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Jonas couldn't shake the feeling of Marcus's lips on his, or the way his touch had made the world stand still. He knew the line they had crossed couldn't be undone, and yet a part of him didn't want to go back. The only thing he was certain of was that nothing would ever be the same. Jonas woke to the pale morning light filtering through his curtains, but the weight in his chest was anything but light. His mind replayed the events of the night before in relentless loops. The way Marcus's touch had lingered, the breathless closeness between them, the kiss that had upended everything. He sat up, raking his hands through his hair. What have I done? The question stabbed at him, not just for its moral implications, but for the chaos it promised to bring. Jonas knew the boundaries they had crossed, and he couldn't unfeel what it had stirred in him. The house was quiet as he made his way to the kitchen, his movements cautious. He didn't want to face Marcus, but knew it was inevitable. Sure enough, Marcus was already there, standing by the window with a cup of coffee in his hand. He didn't turn around, but Jonas could tell by the tension in his shoulders that he'd been expecting him. Morning, Jonas said softly, his voice tentative. Marcus glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. Morning. The air between them was thick, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Jonas shuffled to the counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee, though he had no intention of drinking it. We need to talk, Marcus said finally, breaking the silence. Jonas set his mug down and nodded, his stomach twisting. Yeah, I know. Marcus turned to face him, his eyes heavy with something Jonas couldn't quite name. Regret, maybe, or fear. What happened last night, it can't happen again. Jonas swallowed hard. He'd known Marcus would say it, but hearing the words still hurt. I know, he replied, though his voice wavered. Marcus rubbed the back of his neck, looking away. I don't even know how to explain it. It was a mistake, an incredible mistake, but it doesn't change the fact that it was wrong. Jonas felt his throat tighten. It didn't feel like a mistake, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus froze, his eyes snapping to Jonas's. For a moment, the weight of unspoken truths hung between them, fragile and suffocating. It doesn't matter how it felt, Marcus said finally, his tone firm. We can't let this ruin everything. Jonas nodded, though his heart ached with the truth of it. Does that mean you regret it? Marcus hesitated, his gaze faltering. Regret doesn't even begin to cover it. But he trailed off, his words hanging like an unfinished thought. Jonas stepped closer, his hands trembling at his sides. But what? Marcus sighed, his voice breaking as he spoke. But I can't stop thinking about it. About you. The confession hit Jonas like a wave, pulling him under. He wanted to reach for Marcus, to bridge the distance between them, but he knew it would only make things worse. We can't, Marcus said, almost to himself. It's not fair to anyone. Not to your mother, not to this family, and not to you. Jonas bit his lip, his eyes stinging. So what happens now? Marcus looked at him, his expression pained. We move on. We forget this ever happened. Jonas knew it wasn't possible. He could never forget the way Marcus had made him feel, seen, desired, alive. But he also knew Marcus was right. The rest of the day passed in a blur of avoidance. Jonas stayed in his room, staring at the ceiling and replaying their conversation. He felt torn in two, caught between the desire to hold on to what had happened and the knowledge that he had to let it go. That evening, As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jonas found himself back on the patio. The air was cool, the sky streaked with shades of orange and purple. It was the same place where everything had begun, but now it felt different, heavier. Marcus joined him a few minutes later, standing silently by his side. They didn't speak, but their presence together was enough. A shared acknowledgement of what had been and what could never be again. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Marcus broke the silence. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Jonas. You deserve that." Jonas nodded, his throat tight. "You too." Marcus placed a hand on Jonas's shoulder, a touch that felt final and yet full of meaning. Then he turned and walked back into the house, leaving Jonas alone beneath the endless expanse of the night sky. Jonas stared after him, his heart heavy yet somehow lighter. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew this moment would stay with him, etched into his memory like a scar and a treasure. Somewhere deep inside, Jonas realized that moving on didn't mean forgetting. It meant carrying the weight of what had happened and learning to live with it. And as he gazed at the stars, he promised himself he would,